He signed the divorce papers on the same day she told him about the baby. Didn't hesitate. Didn't look up. Just uncapped his pen, pressed it to the line, and pushed the folder back across the marble desk like it was a quarterly report he'd already forgotten. Vivian Hale stood on the other side of that desk with her hands flat against her stomach and her jaw locked so tight her back teeth ached, and she watched the man she had loved for 6 years reduce their entire life together to a signature and a silence that lasted exactly 4 seconds before he picked up his phone and took another call. She didn't cry, not in front of him. She hadn't survived this world by letting people see where she broke. But she broke. God, she broke. If you've ever stayed with a story until the very last second because you couldn't look away, this is that story. Watch until the end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning it ended, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in November, punishing everyone stupid enough to still be outside. Wind off the lake came in sideways, cold enough to strip paint, and the Moretti building on West Walker stood against it the way it stood against everything, unmoved, glass-faced, giving nothing away. 41st floor, corner office, the kind of room where the furniture alone costs more than most people's houses, and every surface was either marble or steel or the kind of dark wood that absorbed sound the way a confessional booth absorbs secrets. Damian Moretti kept his office cold. He kept it cold the way he kept everything, deliberately, as a test, to see who would shiver and who would stand straight and pretend they didn't feel it. Vivian had learned early never to shiver. She'd been in this building hundreds of times. She knew which elevator the security team preferred. She knew which assistant outside the door would look away if she asked him to, and which one would immediately relay the visit to Damian's inner circle. She knew the exact angle of afternoon light through the corner windows in winter, knew it fell harsh and flat across the left side of the room and left the right side in a half shadow that Damian had always used to his advantage during negotiations he didn't want fully lit. She knew him. That was the thing. She knew him better than anyone alive, and it hadn't saved her. She'd made the appointment through his second assistant, the one who didn't know her history with the organization, just knew her as Mrs. Moretti, the wife, the woman whose name appeared on the charitable foundation letterhead and at the annual gala tables and occasionally in the society page photographs where she stood half a step behind Damian and smiled the way women in her position learned to smile, controlled, measured, giving nothing to the camera that could be used against you later. The appointment was listed as a legal consultation. 12:30, 45 minutes. She arrived at 12:28 carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a charcoal wool coat that cost $3,000 and hid everything, including the fact that her hands were shaking badly enough that she'd had to button it twice. Damian was already behind the desk when she walked in. He didn't stand. He had 4 monitors angled around his workspace, a phone pressed between his ear and his shoulder, and a cup of coffee at his right hand that had gone cold an hour ago because he never actually drank anything once he got into a run of work. He just liked having it there. Something about the ritual of it. She'd always found that detail oddly human. The cold coffee. The one small thing that proved he needed comfort like anyone else, even if he'd die before admitting it. He ended the call when he saw her. Pulled the phone away from his ear, said, "I'll call you back," without waiting for a response, and set it face down on the desk. Then he looked at her, and his expression didn't change, and that was the moment she understood exactly how this was going to go. Vivian. Damian. No kiss, no pretense of warmth. They'd stopped pretending 6 months ago, around the time she realized that the careful distance he'd been putting between them wasn't stress from the Calabrese territory negotiation or the fallout from the Canton Street incident the way he'd claimed. It was decision. He'd been making up his mind about her for months, quietly, the way he made all his most serious decisions, in private, without consulting anyone, and with the kind of deliberate patience that other men mistook for indifference until it was too late. She sat down across from him without being invited because she'd earned that at minimum. The portfolio went on the desk between them. She didn't open it. "I have something to tell you," she said. "And then I have something to show you, and I need you to look at both before you say anything." He folded his hands. "Go ahead." The words she'd rehearsed for 3 days in the bathroom mirror with the water running so the security detail outside her suite couldn't hear her practice them, those words evaporated. What came out instead was plain and direct and unadorned because she was tired of performance, tired of managing the temperature of every room she walked into, tired of being the woman who carefully packaged every truth before delivering it so it didn't disturb the men around her. "I'm pregnant," she said. 11 weeks. I have the confirmation from Dr. Kamara. I'm not going to dress it up and I'm not going to negotiate with you about what it means. I'm telling you because you have the right to know and because I am not the person you seem to think I am. And I thought maybe if I sat across from you and said it out loud, you might remember that. The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. She counted. Damien unfolded his hands. He reached to the left side of his desk, to the second drawer, and he removed a manila folder she'd never seen before. He set it in front of her, and when she opened it, the first thing she saw was her own name at the top of a legal document. The second thing she saw was his signature already on the line at the bottom. He'd signed the divorce papers before she walked through the door. "The terms are generous," he said. His voice was the same temperature as the office. "The Maplewood property transfers to you. The foundation accounts stay in your name. The investment portfolio from your father's estate has already been separated out. You'll have more than enough to—" "Stop." She closed the folder. Her voice didn't break. She was proud of that later in the dark, when she let herself feel things again. "You signed these before I even told you. I had them prepared 2 weeks ago. And the pregnancy doesn't change anything." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something happening behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely read, and that was new. She'd always been able to read him, had spent years learning the exact gradient between his genuine stillness and his performed stillness. And right now, she couldn't tell which one she was looking at. It frightened her more than his anger ever had. "I think," he said carefully, "that we have both run out of useful things to say to each other." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." She looked at the folder. She thought about the 3 days of rehearsal, the speech she'd prepared about truth and loyalty and the years she'd given to a life that wasn't exactly hers but had become hers anyway. She thought about the child. 11 weeks, the size of a lime according to the pamphlet the doctor's nurse had pressed into her hand with a sympathetic smile that Vivian had wanted to put through the wall. She thought about every decision she'd made in the last 6 years that had led her to this cold room, this cold desk, this man who had already signed her out of his life and was now waiting with the particular patience of someone who considered the conversation essentially over. She picked up the folder. She stood up. She buttoned her coat. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Not an accusation. A fact, stated plainly, the way you'd note that it was raining or that the coffee had gone cold. You'll understand that eventually. By then it'll be too late." She walked out. The door closed behind her without a sound. Solid mahogany, good hinges, the kind of door built specifically so that exits don't echo. Damien sat in the silence of his office and did not pick up his phone for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. His assistant, watching through the glass partition, noted this because in 3 years of working for Damien Moretti, he had never once seen the man sit still without a purpose. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it exactly where he kept everything else. To himself, behind glass, giving nothing away. Chut. Vivian did not go back to the suite they'd shared in the Moretti residence on North Astor Street. She went instead to the apartment she'd been quietly maintaining for 14 months, in a building in Wicker Park. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. A 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor that she'd signed for under her mother's maiden name and furnished minimally and kept stocked with enough cash and documentation that she could leave the city inside of 2 hours if she needed to. She'd always known she might need to. That was the thing about Vivian Hale that nobody in Damien's world had ever quite understood. They'd looked at her and seen the wife, seen the carefully constructed exterior of a woman who'd assimilated herself into money and power and the brutal social architecture of organized crime with such grace that she seemed born to it. They'd assumed that the grace meant softness, that the composure meant she had no plan of her own. They were wrong about that in a way that would eventually become very expensive for all of them. She sat in the apartment for an hour with her coat still on, not thinking about the divorce papers or the cold office or the 4-second silence that told her everything. She thought about logistics. She thought about the 11 weeks and what came after and what kind of life she could build with the Maplewood property money and the foundation accounts. More than enough, he'd said, and he wasn't wrong. Damien was many things, but he wasn't cheap. He'd have considered cheapness a form of disrespect. And she thought about the decision she'd already made before she walked into his office. She wasn't going to fight for his empire. She wasn't going to use the pregnancy as leverage. She wasn't going to sit in the Astor Street house and wait for him to change his mind or reward her patience with some recalibrated version of their marriage. She was going to disappear. Quietly, cleanly, the way she'd learned to do everything. She started making calls at 2 in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock, she had a new lease in Indianapolis, signed under a name that didn't trace back to Vivian Hale or the Moretti organization or anything that had been her life for the last 6 years. By 9, she had a single suitcase packed, and the apartment in Wicker Park left exactly as she'd found it, minimally, impersonally, leaving no evidence that anyone with feelings had ever lived there. She did not take the Maplewood property. She did not touch the foundation accounts. She left every dollar he'd offered her exactly where it was, which was a decision she made not from pride. Though pride was part of it, she was honest enough to admit that. But because she understood the kind of man Damien Moretti was, and she knew that the money would have strings attached even if he hadn't consciously attached them. She had watched him use generosity as a leash her entire marriage. She wasn't going to let him do it to her exit. She took what was hers, the investment portfolio from her father's estate, which was technically already separated, her personal documents, the photographs from her mother, physical prints, irreplaceable. She'd kept them in a fireproof box in the Wicker Park apartment because she'd known better than to leave anything she actually valued in the Astor Street house. And one other thing, a small encrypted drive she kept in the inner lining of her winter coat, stitched into a pocket that wasn't there when she bought the coat and wasn't visible when she wore it. She'd been maintaining what was on that drive for 4 years. It was the most dangerous thing she owned, and she had no intention of using it, had never planned to use it, had put it together with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, because the only version of her situation she was unable to survive was the one where she had nothing, where she walked away with no leverage and no proof and no record of what she'd seen and done and quietly corrected in the years she'd spent embedded in an organization that would have destroyed itself 3 times over without her intervention. Nobody in that organization knew she'd been doing it. That was the point. That was the thing about Vivian Hale. She left Chicago at 11:45 on a Wednesday night in November. She took the interstate south, drove through the dark with the heat running and the radio off, and she put one hand flat against her stomach once, just once, somewhere around Kankakee, and she said out loud to nobody, to the road, to the cold, to the small fact of life she was carrying that Damien had dismissed without even asking a single question. "I've got you. Whatever happens, I've got you." Then she put both hands back on the wheel and drove. What she didn't know, and what Damien himself didn't know, though he would, eventually, in the worst possible way, was that the folder on his desk hadn't appeared because he'd finally decided to end the marriage on his own terms. It had been put there, carefully, deliberately, by someone who needed Damien Moretti isolated, needs trusting, and stripped of every intelligence asset he'd been relying on without realizing it, including the one that happened to be his wife. The man's name was Conrad Rael. He ran the Eastern Distribution Corridor for a competitor syndicate out of Detroit, and he'd been watching the Moretti organization for 2 years with the particular attention of someone who wanted something specific rather than just wanting to compete. He wasn't interested in market share. He was interested in the architecture, the quiet structural genius of how the Moretti network had survived multiple federal investigations, 2 territorial wars, and 3 attempted hostile absorptions without losing a single critical asset. He'd tried to find the source of that structural genius for 18 months and come up empty, which meant the source was either Damien himself, unlikely, Damien was tactically brilliant but not structurally patient, or something adjacent to Damien that nobody was looking at because they'd already decided it wasn't important. The wife, it turned out. Conrad Rael had figured it out 9 months ago, had watched Vivian Hale at 3 separate public events with the clinical focus of someone who'd learned to read rooms and hadn't lived this long by trusting first impressions. He'd watched her scan exits, track conversations she wasn't part of, And twice, subtly redirect social interactions in ways that protected Damien from informational exposure he would have never even noticed was happening. She was the apparatus. She was the thing that made the whole machine function without anyone realizing there was a machine. Remove her, and the machine would start to degrade. Maybe slowly. Maybe fast, depending on what else fell away. But certainly. Conrad had spent 6 months building a narrative, rumor, document fragments, a carefully managed leak through a channel he knew would reach Damien's most paranoid captain, suggesting that Vivian Hale had been running an unauthorized communication line with the Valentini family out of New York, that she'd been feeding intelligence, that the pregnancy, if it happened, would be her play for permanent institutional protection through the bloodline, a move the Valentinis would benefit from enormously. Every piece of it was fabricated, every single word. But Damien Moretti, who had survived as long as he had precisely because he treated betrayal as a statistical certainty rather than a personal wound, had received the information and processed it the way he processed everything, methodically, coldly, and without giving the accused any knowledge that they were being evaluated. By the time Vivian walked into his office on that Wednesday morning, he'd already been operating for 2 months on the assumption that she was working against him. He'd been wrong. He didn't know yet that he was wrong. But the wrongness was already in motion, already eating its way through the foundation of everything he'd built. And by the time he understood the full scale of what Conrad Rael had done to him, it would not be a question of damage control. It would be a question of survival. The first sign came 3 weeks after Vivian left Chicago. A captain named Eli Stroud, who had been with the Moretti organization for 11 years and run the Southside collections with the kind of bloodless efficiency that Damien had rewarded generously and frequently, walked into a federal building on a Monday morning and came out 2 hours later with a cooperation agreement that nobody on the Moretti side saw coming. Not the lawyers, not the security detail, not the intelligence man Damien kept on retainer specifically to monitor for this kind of vulnerability. Stroud had been turned. The question was by whom and for how long, and the answer to both of those questions, when Damien's people eventually dug it out, was going to restructure his understanding of the last year and a half in ways that would be physically painful to absorb. But that was coming. Not yet. Right now, on the night that Eli Stroud signed his cooperation agreement, Damien Moretti was in the same cold office on the 41st floor, 3 weeks into running the organization without the wife he'd dismissed, and he was beginning, only beginning, he wouldn't have admitted it even to himself yet, to feel the particular vertigo of someone who has removed what they thought was a decorative element and discovered that the room no longer stands correctly without it. He couldn't have named it, not yet. He was too deeply embedded in the conviction that the intelligence on Vivian had been sound, that his response had been appropriate, that the coldness of the office and the efficiency of the signature and the decision he'd made 2 months before she ever walked through the door were the product of rational threat assessment rather than a catastrophically successful manipulation. He poured 2 fingers of scotch he wouldn't drink and stood at the corner window looking out at the city, and what he felt, if he'd been the kind of man who examined what he felt, was the very early and very quiet signal of something coming apart. Not loudly. Not yet. The way a crack in a dam works before anyone notices. Silent, incremental, deeply committed to its own inevitability. Outside, Chicago pressed against the glass. Cold. Black water. The lights of everything that owed him something or wanted him dead blurring together at 41 floors into a single indifferent glow. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He had a rule about unknown numbers. Everything of importance came through established channels, and anything coming in from outside established channels was either a mistake or a trap. He answered it. Static. Then a voice he didn't recognize, low and unhurried, with the kind of accent that didn't belong to any city he could immediately place. "You made a mistake," the voice said. "She was never working against you. But someone made sure you'd think she was. And now that she's gone, whatever was holding your house together is going to start coming down. You've got maybe 60 days before the first real piece falls. I'd suggest spending some of that time thinking about who benefits from you being alone." The line went dead. Damien stood at the window for a long time after that. The scotch sat untouched on the corner of the desk. The city outside was indifferent and enormous and full of people who wanted things from him or wanted things done to him, and somewhere in that city, or not in it anymore, he didn't know, nobody knew, was a woman carrying his child whom he had signed out of his life based on intelligence that a voice on an unknown number was telling him had been fabricated. He thought about the 4-second silence after he'd shown her the papers. He thought about the way she'd stood up, buttoned her coat, said, "You're making a mistake," in the same tone someone would use to report an observable fact. He thought about the words she'd said at the end, the ones he'd filed as wounded pride, as the kind of parting shot that a woman makes when she's lost the negotiation and knows it. You'll understand that eventually. By then, it'll be too late. He picked up his phone. He pulled up the contact for the investigator his organization used for internal matters. The man who delivered the intelligence on Vivian in the first place. The man who had come to him 6 months ago with document fragments and a recorded conversation and an expression of genuine regret that had seemed, at the time, entirely authentic. He called the number. It went straight to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He pulled up the man's secondary number, the one reserved for emergencies, and when that went to voicemail as well, he set the phone down on the desk with a deliberate gentleness that in Damien Moretti was significantly more dangerous than if he'd thrown it through the window. He sat down. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the chair where Vivian had sat 3 weeks ago, and told him she was pregnant and waited for a response he was already incapable of giving because he'd spent 2 months deciding she was his enemy. The chair was just a chair, leather, Italian, $4,800. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone again and called the one man in his organization he trusted completely, his consigliere, Marcus Webb, who had known Damien since they were young and stupid and still believed they were the most dangerous things in any room they walked into. "Marcus," he said when the call connected, "I need you to find something out for me. I need to know where Vivian is." A pause on the other end, then carefully, "She walked away clean, Damien. No forwarding contact, no traceable. I know she walked away clean," he paused. "That's not actually what I'm asking. I need to know who told her to go. And I need to know what they offered her to stay gone." Another pause. Longer. "You think the intelligence was bad?" Damien looked out at the city, the water, the lights. "I think," he said slowly, "that someone has been running a play on me for the better part of a year, and I've been executing it for them. And I think the first thing I need to understand is the full scope of what's already been lost." He heard Marcus exhale. "I'll start tonight," Marcus said. "Do that." He ended the call and sat in the cold office and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that Damien Moretti genuinely could not afford to feel. Not grief. Not yet. Not guilt. Those were categories he'd sealed off years ago, and the seals were good. They'd held through worse. What he felt was simpler than that, more dangerous in its own way. He felt the specific dread of a man who has just begun to understand the scale of what he destroyed. And somewhere south of Chicago, on a highway that didn't lead back to anything he knew, Vivian Hale was driving through the dark with her hand on the wheel and a child she had already decided would never know what his father was. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the people who'd used Damien to get rid of her weren't finished with her yet. They had other uses for her in mind. And the distance she was putting between herself and Chicago wasn't going to be anywhere near enough. Marcus Webb found the first hole on a Thursday. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of discovery that announced itself with noise or violence or the sudden clarity of something breaking. It was a number in a ledger, a routing number attached to a transfer record that should have routed through the Moretti holding structure in the Caymans and instead had quietly, efficiently routed somewhere else entirely. And Marcus sat in the back office of the dry cleaning front on West Belmont with the printout in his hand and felt the particular cold of someone who has just understood that the floor they're standing on has been hollow for longer than they want to calculate. He called Damien at 11:47 at night. "How bad?" Damien said instead of hello. "I don't know yet. That's what worries me." "Give me what you have." Marcus spread the papers across the table. 3 weeks of digging, and what he had was this. 6 separate transfer anomalies across 4 different holding structures, all of them small enough individually to pass routine review, all of them patterned in a way that suggested someone who understood the architecture of Damien's financial network well enough to move through it without triggering the automatic flags. Not a smash and grab, something slower, something that had been running for Marcus's best estimate, and he checked it 3 times because he didn't want it to be right, somewhere between 8 and 14 months. Someone's been bleeding you, Marcus said. Not fast, controlled. The kind of bleed where you don't feel it until you've already lost enough that the feeling of it starts to matter. Silence on the other end. Damien processing. Marcus had known him long enough to hear the difference between the silences. The one where Damien was deciding something, the one where he was calculating, and this one, which Marcus recognized with a low-grade dread as the silence where Damien was reorienting his entire map of recent history. Same time period as the intelligence on Vivian, Damien said. Yes. Who has access to all 4 holding structures? On paper? You, me, the accountant Ferraro, and Marcus stopped. Say it. Vivian had read access to 2 of them, through the Foundation co-signatory arrangement you set up in 2021. But Damien, read access. She couldn't have initiated transfers. I know that. So whoever did this either had access I don't know about, or they had someone inside the accounting layer, or both. Damien's voice, when it came back, was very quiet. It wasn't Vivian, I know that now. The question is who used her to clear the board so they could get to me directly. Marcus picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. There's something else. Of course there is. Eli Stroud. Before he walked into the federal building, the week before, he had 3 meetings I can't account for. Off schedule, off site, no security log. I pulled the traffic camera footage from the blocks around where his car was parked. He paused. The man he met with. I ran the face. He's Detroit. The quality of the silence changed. Conrad Rail, Damien said. Not a question. You know him. I know of him. We've never had direct contact. He runs Eastern distribution for the Holloway Syndicate. Damien paused. He's been quiet for 2 years. Too quiet for someone in his position. Quiet because he was busy, Marcus said. Damien, if he turned Stroud, if he built the intelligence package on Vivian, if the financial bleed is his operation, this isn't a competitor making a move. This is a dismantling, systematic. Somebody paid for the whole architecture of this, the timeline, the resources, the patience. This took planning, real planning. I know. We need to find her. Another silence. This one different from all the others. Something in it that Marcus, who had known Damien Moretti since they were 17 years old, had genuinely never heard before. Something pressed down and compressed and not entirely under control. I know, Damien said again. She might not want to be found. I know that too. Marcus looked at the papers spread across the table. The numbers, the roots, the careful, methodical evidence of someone who had spent more than a year building towards something that was now well underway. You understand that if Rael knows she's gone, if he arranged it, he may have people watching for her to surface. Whatever protection she had from being adjacent to you, she doesn't have that now. She has herself, Damien said, and then quieter. She was always better at this than I gave her credit for. She'll be careful. Being careful isn't the same as being safe. No, Damien said, it's not. He ended the call. Marcus sat in the back office of the dry cleaning front and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and thought about Vivian Hale the way he'd always thought about her, as the most underestimated person in any room she'd ever walked into, including rooms full of men who killed people for a living and believed, with the unexamined confidence of the genuinely dangerous, that they were the most important thing in any space they occupied. He'd seen her once, at a dinner 18 months ago, quietly redirect a conversation between 2 captains that had been sliding toward a territorial argument that would have gotten ugly fast. Redirect it so smoothly, so naturally, that neither captain had any idea it had happened. He'd watched her do it and felt for the first time a precise and genuine unease about what would happen to the organization if she weren't in it. Now he knew. He gathered the papers, locked them in the case under the table, and started making calls of his own. In Indianapolis, Vivian Hale was not being careful so much as being invisible. which was a different thing and, in her assessment, more reliable. She'd picked the neighborhood deliberately, not downtown, not the suburbs with their neighborhood watch signs and curious eyes, but a middle stretch of the east side where people had enough of their own problems that a quiet woman with a modest car and a habit of keeping her blinds mostly closed didn't register as unusual. She'd introduced herself to the building super as Claire Weston, showed him a lease signed by Claire Weston, paid Claire Weston's first 3 months in cash with the kind of pleasant lack of interest in small talk that people in that neighborhood generally respected. She was 23 weeks along now. The coat didn't hide it anymore. She'd stopped trying to hide it and started instead just moving through the world with the matter-of-fact physicality of a woman who has accepted the current reality of her own body, which was large and uncomfortable and occasionally felt like it was being operated by someone else. She had a job, administrative work at a medical billing company, 30 hours a week, legitimate employment she'd secured with the documentation her attorney contact in Cincinnati had spent 2 months building. And she had a routine, and she had, for the first time in 6 years, a life that was entirely her own construction. Small, quiet, hers. She thought about Chicago sometimes, mostly at night, when the city sounds through the window were different enough from what she was used to that sleep came slowly. She thought about the Astor Street house and the cold office and the signature executed with the blank efficiency of a man who had already put her in the category of solved problems. She thought about the 4-second silence that had told her everything. She didn't let herself think about him, not as a person, not the version she'd known before the last 18 months of careful, incremental distance had replaced whatever they'd been to each other with a professional arrangement so emptied of warmth that she'd sometimes sat across from him at dinner and felt like she was looking at a stranger who had borrowed her husband's face. She thought about the child instead. That was useful. That was a thing she could put her attention toward that didn't eat her from the inside. She was thinking about the child, specifically about the logistics of single parenthood, the daycare situation, the question of what Claire Weston's employment history would look like in 3 years when her son started asking questions that required real answers, when her phone buzzed on the kitchen table with a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she answered. "Don't hang up," the voice said. Male, middle-aged, the kind of careful enunciation that suggested someone who'd learned English as a second language young enough to lose the accent, but not young enough to lose the precision. "I'm not calling on behalf of anyone in Chicago. I'm calling because the people who made sure Damian Moretti signed those papers before you walked into his office are now aware that you left without taking anything, and that is a problem for them." Her hand was very steady on the phone. She was proud of that. Why? Because a woman who leaves everything on the table isn't a woman who's been bought, and they need to know whether you can be bought or whether you need to be dealt with another way. She stood up, moved to the window, checked the street, automatic, trained, the habit of 6 years of living adjacent to violence and learning to read the urban environment for threat the way other people read weather. Who are you? Someone who has been watching Conrad Rael operate for a long time and has reasons of my own for wanting his plan to fail. You and I want the same thing, Mrs. Moretti. We want the same outcome. The difference is that you don't know the full picture yet, and I do. Don't call me that. A pause. My apologies, Vivian. She looked at the street. A car she didn't recognize was parked 2 buildings down. It had been there yesterday, too, which she'd noted and filed and decided was probably nothing. She revised that assessment now. The car on the street, is that yours? A brief silence that confirmed it. Yes, nobody else's. You're not being watched by anyone working against you. Not yet. But that window is going to close, and when it does, the people Conrad Rail sends are not the kind of people who leave situations unresolved. What do you want from me? Right now, nothing. I want to give you information. What you do with it is your business. He paused. Damian knows the intelligence on you was fabricated. He's been aware for approximately 3 weeks. He's looking for you. The information hit her somewhere below the sternum. She absorbed it without speaking for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet. 2 buildings down, the car that belonged to the voice on the phone sat motionless. That doesn't change anything. It doesn't have to change anything. I'm not calling to broker a reconciliation. I'm calling because you have something on that drive that you've been carrying for 4 years. And that information is the only thing in existence that can bring Conrad Rael's entire operation down. And Rael knows you have it because the man who originally put together the intelligence package on you had access to your communications in the Moretti network. He knows what you built. He just doesn't know what's on it. Vivian went very still. And that, the voice said, is why you have a window, and why the window will close, and why I am standing here instead of letting it happen. She turned away from the window, sat back down at the kitchen table. The phone in her hand felt suddenly heavier, the way objects do when they become weighted with implication. How long do I have? Weeks, maybe less. Rael is still consolidating. He needs the Moretti operation destabilized enough that stepping in looks like rescue rather than takeover. Once that phase is done, the loose ends get attention. I'm a loose end. You're the loose end, the one that could actually blow the whole architecture if you decided to. She pressed her hand flat against the table. The kitchen was small and clean and smelled faintly of the coffee she'd made at 6 that morning, and the particular domestic quiet of a life that had, until 30 seconds ago, felt like it might actually work. Give me 24 hours. You have it. My number will show if you call back. A pause. The child. It's a boy, yes? She didn't answer that. Take care of yourself, the voice said, and ended the call. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The coffee was cold. The street outside was quiet. 2 buildings down, a car with a man in it who claimed to be on her side was either exactly what he said he was or the most patient and elaborate feint she'd ever encountered. She opened her laptop, pulled up the encrypted partition, typed the password that she'd never written down anywhere, that existed only in her memory, constructed from a phrase that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't her. The drive opened. She looked at 4 years of documentation and felt, for the first time since she'd left Chicago, something that wasn't exactly fear and wasn't exactly grief. Something with more edges than either of those. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't chosen. Talking about Damien's second captain to flip was a man named Dario Pucci, and unlike Eli Stroud, Pucci didn't go to the federal building quietly. Pucci went out like a fire. 2 weeks after Stroud's cooperation agreement became known in the organization, Pucci walked into a meeting that Damien had arranged specifically to gauge his loyalty, sat down across the table from Damien and Marcus and 2 of the organization's senior attorneys, and before the meeting was even formally opened, put a recording device on the table and said, "I've been wearing this for 6 weeks. Everything in this room goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office on Monday unless we reach an understanding right now." The table went quiet. Damien looked at the recorder, then at Pucci. Pucci was sweating, visibly, badly, the kind of full-body sweat that happens when adrenaline has been running too long and the body is starting to present the bill. His hands on the table weren't steady. He'd rehearsed this moment, probably many times, and the rehearsal was not surviving contact with the reality of sitting across from Damien Moretti and having just said what he'd said. 6 weeks, Damien said. His voice was completely flat. You've been wired for 6 weeks. Yeah. And in 6 weeks, you've recorded what exactly? Describe it to me. Pucci swallowed. Enough. Enough is not a description. Describe it. 2 operational planning meetings. The North Side consolidation discussion. The conversation with the port contacts about the February shipment. He stopped. Enough to put people away, Damien. Enough to make this conversation worth having. Marcus shifted in his chair. One of the attorneys put a hand flat on the table. A gesture that meant wait, that meant don't, that meant let's all be adults about this. Damien ignored both of them. Who approached you? Damien said. That's not who approached you. Pucci's jaw tightened. He was calculating, running the angles, trying to determine whether the answer to that question served him or buried him. Someone from outside the organization said they had enough on me already to hand me to the feds without any cooperation. Said the alternative was this: 6 weeks, specific targets, and then I'd be moved and set up somewhere clean. Specific targets, Damien repeated. What were you asked to get? Evidence of your direct involvement in operational decisions, not the management layer. You specifically. Your voice, your words, your decisions. Pucci looked at the table. They wanted enough to end you, not the organization. You. Damien let that sit for a moment. Under the table, his hands were very still. Above the table, his face was giving nothing away. Marcus was watching him with the specific attention of someone waiting to see which version of a dangerous man they were about to be in the room with. "And did you get it?" Damien said. "No." Pucci's voice dropped. "You don't... In 6 weeks, you didn't say anything specific. You never do. I don't know how you run this thing without ever saying anything specific, but you do, and I couldn't. The recordings aren't what they wanted. So they're going to leave you out in the cold." Pucci looked up. There was something in his face that wasn't quite pleading. He had enough pride left for it not to be quite that, but was adjacent to it. "I did what they asked, and they came back and said it wasn't enough, and that the deal was contingent on..." He stopped. "I'm dead if I walk out of here without something, and I'm dead if this goes to Monday. I've got nowhere." "Yes," Damien said, "you don't." He stood up. He buttoned his jacket with the methodical precision of someone who performs physical actions as a way of creating space for thought. He looked at Pucci for a long moment. "The recorder," he said. "Pick it up. Take it with you. Walk out of here, and then call whoever approached you and tell them the meeting fell apart before anything useful was said." Pucci blinked. "Why?" "Because I need them to think their operation inside my organization is still running, and I need you to go back to them and tell them you need more time." Damien picked up his phone from the table. "You're going to become useful to me, Pucci. Whether that ends well for you depends entirely on how useful you manage to be." He walked out of the room. Marcus followed. In the hallway with the door closed behind them, Marcus grabbed his arm. "Damien, he's been wired. We can't..." "He's been wired by Conrad Rael's people. The recordings don't have anything that matters because I don't say things that matter in rooms with more than 2 people in them, and Rael apparently didn't fully understand that." He pulled his arm free. "He's more useful inside than out. We run him as a double. He feeds Rael information we control. We buy time. And when Rael figures out the recordings are useless and cuts him loose, then we make sure we've found Vivian before that happens." He started walking. "Because whatever she has on that drive is what ends this. I've known that for 2 weeks. I just need to find her before Rael does." "What?" She called the number back at 11 the next morning. "I want a meeting," she said when he answered. "In person. Public place, my choice, and I come alone." "Agreed. And I want to know who you are before I sit across from you. Real name." A pause. "Leon Vasquez. I worked for a private intelligence firm that had a contract monitoring the Holloway Syndicate's expansion activity. Conrad Rael burned my firm 8 months ago, got our main analyst killed, and our primary client spooked enough to terminate the contract. I've been running this personally since then." "Revenge," she said. "Accountability," he said. "I'm old enough to know the difference." She picked the location, a public library branch on the north side of Indianapolis, Tuesday morning, the reading room that opened onto the main floor, so there were sight lines in 3 directions. She arrived 20 minutes early and sat with a book she wasn't reading and watched every entrance until a man in his late 50s came through the main door alone, medium height, gray at the temples, moving through the space with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who spent a lot of time in unfamiliar places and had learned to treat them all with equal wariness. He sat down across from her. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at her with the kind of direct clinical assessment she'd spent years learning to perform herself. "You're further along than I expected," he said, glancing at her midsection without embarrassment. 25 weeks. "You've been careful." "Careful enough." She put the book on the table between them, face down, spine up. "Tell me what you know about Rael's timeline." He told her. It took 40 minutes and involved a level of operational detail that confirmed for Vivian that Leon Vasquez was exactly what he said he was. A professional intelligence man running a personal operation, organized and methodical and driven by something that had calcified from grief into purpose. His analyst, the one Rael had gotten killed, had been 29 years old and 3 months from his wedding. Vasquez talked about it once, quickly, with the flat economy of a man who has processed the fact of it, but not the weight of it, and then moved on. The picture he built was this. Rael had been running the Moretti destabilization for 14 months. The financial bleed was ongoing. 2 captains turned, a third in process. The goal was not acquisition of territory. Rael didn't want the Moretti operations market, which was too Chicago-specific to be useful to a Detroit-based network. What he wanted was the infrastructure, the specific architecture of relationships, federal contacts, port authorities, logistics chains, that had taken the Moretti organization 20 years to build and that couldn't simply be seized but could be transferred quietly to a new controlling interest if the current controlling interest could be removed without enough noise to draw serious attention. To do that cleanly, Damien needed to be legally exposed and removed rather than killed. A hit on Damien Moretti would trigger exactly the kind of federal investigation that would freeze the infrastructure for years. So the play was criminal prosecution, get Damien indicted, get him buried in legal proceedings, and step into the vacuum as a stabilizing presence. The piece that Vivian represented, the piece that Rael had spent 6 months trying to engineer her removal from, was that she had, over 4 years of quiet and unacknowledged work, built a documentary record of Conrad Rael's own operations that was detailed enough to do exactly what a federal prosecution of Damien would do to him: freeze his assets, expose his network, and create years of legal liability that would collapse the Holloway Syndicate's Eastern operation from the inside. She'd built it as insurance. She'd never planned to use it. "He knows you have it," Vasquez said. "He doesn't know what's on it, but he knows it exists. The analyst he killed 8 months ago, your name came up in what we recovered from his research before they got to him. Just your name and the phrase, documentation, scope unknown. That was enough for Rael to make you a priority." Vivian looked at the table. The library was quiet around them, the soft shuffle of someone at the returns desk, a child somewhere in the children's section laughing at something. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary Tuesday morning in a life that was supposed to be quiet and small and hers. "If I hand what I have to a federal contact," she said, "Rael's operation stops. But so does everything in Chicago. Damien goes down with it. Some of it, yes, not all. What you have on Rael is specific to Rael's operations. What it overlaps with the Moretti network is limited, because Rael was careful about that. He didn't want direct evidentiary connection between himself and the organization he was trying to absorb. You could make a targeted disclosure." He paused. "Or you could give it to Damien." She looked up. "No? He's been looking for you for 3 weeks. I know. He knows the intelligence was fabricated. I know that too." Her voice was steady. "It doesn't change what he did. He had those papers signed before I walked in the door. He didn't ask me a single question. 6 years, and when someone told him I was working against him, he didn't come to me. He didn't give me the chance to—" She stopped, pressed her hand flat on the table, a habit, something to do with the physical energy of not saying the rest of it. "I'm not doing this for him. I'm doing it because I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because Conrad Rael decided I was a loose end." Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. He didn't try to argue with her, which she appreciated. "Then you need to move," he said. "Not here. Somewhere I can put a perimeter around while you make the contact. I have a property in Ohio, 40 minutes from Columbus. Secure, off record, and I can have 2 people there within 12 hours. You want me to move at 25 weeks pregnant. I want you alive at 26 weeks pregnant. The choice is yours." She looked at the window. Outside, the Indiana winter was doing its colorless, uninspired best. A library parking lot, half empty, no one moving, ordinary. "I need 48 hours, she said. "I have things in the apartment I need to handle." "You have 24. And Vivian." He leaned forward slightly. "Don't call anyone in Chicago, not Marcus Webb, not the attorneys, nobody. If Rael has a tap running on any of those lines and your voice shows up, the window closes immediately." She met his eyes. "I know how to disappear." "I know you do." He stood. "That's why you're still in one piece." He left. She sat in the library for another 10 minutes with her hand resting on the table and the book in front of her unread, and she thought about the drive in the lining of her coat and the 48 hours she'd given herself and the 47 hours and 59 minutes she was going to spend executing a transition that would, if everything went right, end Conrad Rael and everything he'd built. And she thought, briefly, unwillingly, about the fact that somewhere in Chicago a man was looking for her. A man who had signed the papers before she walked in, who had processed her pregnancy as a tactical maneuver rather than a human fact, who had spent 2 months deciding she was his enemy based on fabricated intelligence and never once come to her and said, not asked, just said, what he'd been told. She thought about all of it. She stood up, buttoned her coat over the reality of 25 weeks and the son she was going to raise in a city that wasn't Chicago with a name that wasn't Moretti, and she walked out of the library into the cold. 12 hours later, standing in the apartment on the east side, with her single bag packed and the lease she'd have to abandon and the job at the billing company she'd have to disappear from, her phone rang. The number was Vasquez's. She answered. "Change of timeline," he said, and his voice had a quality to it she hadn't heard in either of their previous conversations. Something compressed, something that was working hard to stay controlled. One of Rael's people made contact with a source in Indianapolis 2 hours ago. They're looking for a pregnant woman with your description in this city. They don't have a name yet, but they have a neighborhood. Her blood went cold. Somewhere in her chest, her heartbeat shifted. Not faster, just harder, more deliberate, the way the body decides autonomously and without consultation that this is a moment that requires full resources. "How long?" she said. "Hours. Maybe less." She looked at the apartment, at the small, clean life she'd built in the span of 3 months, the coffee maker and the library books, and the single photograph of her mother she'd propped on the kitchen windowsill because she'd needed something of her own in a space that still felt borrowed. "I need 20 minutes. You have 10. She picked up the bag. She took the photograph. She did not look back at the apartment when she closed the door because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her, when she was young enough that the lesson had gone all the way down to bone, that looking back is something you do after you're safe. She wasn't safe yet. She took the stairs. Outside, the night was cold and ordinary, and full of people who didn't know that somewhere in the city, a man was asking questions about a pregnant woman with no name, and the woman he was looking for was moving through the dark with a coat buttoned over everything that mattered, and a drive sewn into its lining that could end Conrad Rael's empire or start a war, depending entirely on who she gave it to first. She reached the car, got in, started the engine. Her phone buzzed. Not Vasquez. An unknown number. She stared at it for 3 full seconds, the engine running, the heat starting to build, the parking lot empty and still around her. She answered. "Vivian." The voice was one she hadn't heard in 3 months. One she'd spent 3 months successfully not thinking about in the specific way she'd needed to not think about it. Low. Controlled. The temperature of a room that was always kept cold on purpose. "Damien." "How did you get this number?" she said. "Marcus is better at this than either of us wants to admit." A pause. Not 4 seconds this time. Longer. "Are you safe?" She looked at the parking lot, at the street beyond it, at the ordinary dark of an Indianapolis night that was, as of 2 hours ago, not entirely ordinary anymore. "Not entirely," she said. "Tell me where you are." "No." "Vivian." I said no. Her voice came out harder than she intended, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. She wasn't sure anymore. "You don't get to call me and say, 'Tell me where you are,' like the last 3 months didn't happen. Like the papers you'd already signed before I walked in didn't happen." "I know what I did." "Good. Then you understand why the answer is no." Silence. "Someone is looking for you," he said. "Conrad Rael. He knows you're in Indianapolis." "I already know that." A pause. "You already know." He absorbed that. She could almost feel him reconfiguring, rerunning the last 60 seconds with new variables. "You've been talking to someone." "I've been handling it." "By yourself. Pregnant. In a city I didn't know you were in." "Yes," she said, "because that's what I do when I'm on my own." The silence that followed was longer than any of the previous ones. She sat in the running car in the empty parking lot, and looked at the street and felt, despite everything she'd put between herself and this moment, the specific ache of hearing his voice after 3 months of successfully not hearing it. "I'm coming to you," he said. "Don't." "Vivian." "Damien." She shut her eyes, opened them. "I am 25 weeks pregnant, and I have been running my own operation for 3 months, and I have an asset on this drive that can end Conrad Rael permanently. I do not need you to come to me. I need you to stay in Chicago and let me handle this, and trust me for once in your—" She stopped, breathed. "Just trust me. Once. That's all I'm asking." Another silence. She could hear him breathing, shallow, controlled, the particular rhythm of a man who is exerting enormous effort to not say the first thing that comes to him. "What's on the drive?" "Everything you'd need to end Rael. 4 years of his operations. Financial trails, transaction records, communication logs. Enough for a federal case that shuts down the Holloway Syndicate's entire Eastern network." "How do you have that?" "Because I've been watching him watch you for 4 years, and you never knew either of us was in the room." Her voice was flat. She hadn't meant for it to come out like an accusation, but that was what it was, and she was too tired to sand the edges off it. "This is what I do, Damien. This is what I was doing. While you were deciding, I was working against you. I was building the file that could protect you from the person who actually was." The silence this time was very different from all the ones before it. She started to speak, and then the rear window of the car exploded inward. Glass everywhere. Her arms up instinctively, hands over her head, the bag on the seat beside her catching most of it, and the cold night air rushing in through the hole where the window had been. And she was already moving, already putting the car in drive before her mind had consciously processed what had happened, already accelerating out of the parking lot because she did not need her mind to catch up. Her body knew what this was. The phone had fallen into the footwell. She could hear Damien's voice coming out of it, loud, sharp, a single word repeated. Her name, just her name, over and over. She took the first left, then the second, put 3 blocks between herself and the parking lot, and then pulled over and reached down for the phone with one hand while the other stayed on the wheel. "I'm driving," she said when she got it to her ear. "I'm fine. I'm driving." What happened? His voice was not controlled anymore. That was new. She'd never heard him lose the control before. "Someone found me faster than expected." She checked the mirror. Clear. Kept driving. "I have to go. I have to call Vasquez." "Who is—" "The person helping me. I have to go." "Vivian?" A sound she couldn't entirely categorize. "Don't hang up." She almost didn't. That was the honest truth of it. She almost didn't hang up, almost kept the line open, almost said something that the last 3 months, and the signed papers, and the 4-second silence did not entitle her to say to him. Instead, she said, "I'll contact you when I'm clear," and ended the call. She drove north. The cold came in through the broken window and hit her face, and she kept her eyes on the road and both hands on the wheel, and she did not let herself think about his voice when the control had dropped out of it, or the specific sound of her name repeated in the dark like something being held onto. She drove. Behind her, in a parking lot 3 blocks south, a man with a phone pressed to his ear was relaying a location to someone who reported to Conrad Rael, and the words he used were not Vivian Hale and not Claire Weston, but simply the target is moving, northbound, and the response he received back was 4 words that meant the window Vasquez had described to her, the one that was going to close, had just closed. Find her before morning. She drove for 11 minutes before the second car appeared. Not behind her. That would have been manageable, would have been a pursuit she could work with, something with geometry and options and the clean simplicity of faster versus slower. This one came from the side, from a cross street she hadn't had time to evaluate, and it didn't ram her or cut her off. It just appeared in the lane beside her and matched her speed exactly, and the man in the passenger seat turned and looked at her through the glass with the specific blankness of someone who is performing a function rather than making a decision, and that blankness was more frightening than aggression would have been. Vivian kept her speed steady, both hands on the wheel. The cold air coming through the broken rear window hit the back of her neck, and she felt it in her spine, and she did not let herself think about the 25 weeks or the sun or anything except the next 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was the only planning horizon that mattered right now. She hit the brake hard, not a stop, a controlled drop in speed that created enough gap between her and the car ahead that she could take the right turn without signaling, hard into a residential street, narrow parked cars on both sides, a move that the car beside her couldn't mirror without crossing oncoming traffic. She heard tires on asphalt. They were adjusting. Her phone buzzed on the seat. Vasquez. She answered it on speaker and threw it on the dash. I have a secondary vehicle. They knew I was moving. I know. His voice was clipped, stripped of everything that wasn't operational. There's a parking structure 3 blocks north of your current heading. Multi-level, 2 exits. Go to level 4. My people are already there. How many are on me? 2 vehicles confirmed, possibly a third. Vivian, don't stop moving. She didn't answer. She was already taking the next left, reading the street signs in the dark, calculating the 3 blocks against the sound of cars she could hear adjusting behind her. The neighborhood was quiet. 11:30 on a weeknight, the kind of residential quiet where a car moving fast registers as wrong. And she was aware, in some background processing layer beneath the immediate mechanics of the situation, that she was leaving a trail of disturbed air through streets where people were asleep, and none of this was their problem. The parking structure appeared on her right. She took the entrance without slowing enough to find it comfortable, scraped the right side of the car against the concrete pillar at the entry level because the turning radius was tighter than she'd judged, and drove the spiral ramp with the engine echoing off bare concrete walls and the broken rear window making the car sound hollow and exposed. Level 4. 2 men she didn't know, standing near a dark SUV, moving toward her before she'd fully stopped. She had the door open before the engine was off, and she was already standing, already scanning the structure, when the taller of the 2 reached her. Vasquez sent us. I'm Reyes. This is Cho. He looked at her with the rapid professional assessment of someone checking for injury. Can you walk fast? I can run if I need to. Let's not need to. He took the bag from her hand without asking. The SUV. Now. She got in. Cho took the wheel. Reyes got in the back beside her and kept his eyes on the entry ramp and his hand near his jacket in a way that communicated everything without words. The SUV was moving before the door was fully closed. Where's Vasquez? She said. Meeting us at the secondary location. Reyes kept his eyes on the ramp. You made contact with someone in Chicago tonight. It wasn't a question, and the fact that it wasn't a question told her something she didn't like. Vasquez told you to ask me that. He's asking now, yes or no? Yes. She watched the structure's lower levels slide past as they descended. My husband called. Ex-husband. How does that change anything? Reyes didn't answer immediately. He exchanged a look with Cho in the rearview mirror. Brief, coded, the kind of look between people who work together long enough that words become redundant. It might not, Reyes said. Vasquez will talk to you about it. She filed that. They exited the structure from the secondary exit, the one facing a different street than she'd entered from, and she watched the block as they turned and saw no vehicles she recognized and felt the first thin edge of something that might eventually become relief. Not yet. But the direction of things had shifted slightly. She pressed her hand against her side. The sun had been still during all of it. The shot window, the driving, the parking structure. But now she felt movement, a slow, deliberate repositioning, the unconscious physical commentary of a life that had no access to the situation and was simply, persistently existing. Okay, she said quietly, to herself, to the movement. Okay. Cool. The secondary location was a warehouse office on the western edge of the city, a legitimate business front, some kind of light manufacturing operation that ran day shifts only, empty and locked by 6 and unremarkable from the outside in the way that useful spaces tend to be unremarkable. Vasquez was already there when the SUV arrived, standing in the loading bay with a phone to his ear and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not controlled. Not the careful, unhurried attention of a man managing a situation. Something tighter than that. Something that had been managing itself for a while and was starting to show the effort. He ended the call when she got out of the SUV. Looked at her. The coat, the bag, the broken glass still caught in her hair that she hadn't had a chance to deal with, and for a moment something moved in his face that might have been relief, or the professional equivalent of it. "You're intact," he said. "Mostly." She pulled a piece of glass from her hair, looked at it, dropped it. "Who told them I was moving?" He held the door open. She walked past him into a space that smelled of machine oil and old coffee and the particular industrial quiet of a building that runs on schedules. A table, chairs, a laptop open on the table with multiple feeds running, street cameras, she realized, from the neighborhood she'd just left. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me who told them I was moving." He sat across from her, laced his hands together on the table, looked at her with the direct, undecorated gaze of someone who is about to say something he's been holding for longer than this conversation. "What I'm going to tell you," he said, "is going to be difficult to hear. And I need you to hear all of it before you respond, because your instinct is going to be to respond before I'm finished, and if you do that, you'll miss the part that matters most." Vivian felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Say it." "Damien's call to you tonight. The number he used came through a routing sequence I set up specifically to prevent external monitoring. The only way Rael's people could have known you were in motion within minutes of that call is if someone in the immediate circle around Damien, someone with access to his communication equipment or his location data tonight, relayed your position." She stared at him. "Marcus Webb?" "Possibly. Or someone in the security detail who was running a secondary channel. I don't know who specifically. What I know is that the call was the trigger, and that means—" He paused. "It means Damien doesn't know someone that close to him is relaying information in real time. And it means his coming to you, which he will do, I think you know he will do, is a vector. Not because he intends it to be, because he doesn't know his own perimeter is compromised." She sat with that for a moment. The warehouse was quiet around them. Reyes and Cho had taken positions near the loading bay doors without being asked to. The laptop on the table ran its silent feeds. "How long have you known there was a secondary leak in his circle?" she said. "Suspected. Since last week." He met her eyes. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to make contact with him, and I was aware that if you knew the full picture, you might decide to handle it yourself." "That's not your call." "No," he said, "it's not. And I'm telling you now, which is the correction of a decision I made badly." He didn't look away. She'd noticed across their interactions a particular quality of accountability. He didn't dress mistakes up as strategy. He just named them and moved. She respected that, even when it made her want to put her hand through the table. The more pressing question is what we do with it. We identify who's running the secondary channel inside Damien's circle, and we don't let him come to me until we know. Agreed. He unlocked the laptop, turned it toward her. "I need you to look at something." On the screen was a photograph. Surveillance quality, taken from a distance, showing two men in a parking lot she didn't immediately recognize. One of the men she didn't know. The other one she did. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "When was this taken?" she said. 6 days ago. Detroit. That's the parking structure adjacent to the hotel where Rael held his senior operations meeting last week." He let that land. "The man with Rael is someone you recognize." "Yes." Her voice was very flat. "His name is Thomas Ferraro. He's been the Moretti organization's primary accountant for 9 years. He's also been running the financial bleed you've been documenting traces of for the last 14 months. He's the inside layer. Rael couldn't have run the financial operation without someone who knew the full architecture of Damien's holding structures. Not just access to 2 of them, but all of them. Ferraro has that access." She looked at the photograph. Thomas Ferraro, 61 years old. She'd sat across from him at the Foundation's annual audit review every year for 5 years. Had watched him present figures with the careful, mildly exasperated air of a man who loved numbers and found people somewhat less reliable. She'd found him mildly comforting in the way that genuinely competent people tend to be comforting. Predictable, precise, transparently motivated by craft rather than ambition. Wrong about that. "How long?" she said. "We think from the beginning, before Rael made his first move. Ferraro may have been the one who identified you to Rael in the first place, the one who told him what you were doing and why it mattered. She set her hand flat on the table. The feeling in her chest was something she didn't have a clean name for. It was adjacent to rage, which was unusual. She'd spent years learning to experience anger as information rather than sensation, learning to keep it at a functional distance where it could be used rather than felt. This was closer. This sat behind her sternum and pushed. Ferraro. 9 years, every audit, every figure, every number on every ledger that passed between Damien's financial architecture and the outside world. "Does Damien know?" she said. "Not yet. When you tell him, he's going to want to..." "I know what he's going to want to do. That's secondary." Vasquez leaned forward. "The primary issue is the drive. Rael has now confirmed you're in Indianapolis. He's confirmed you're moving. He doesn't have you, but he will redouble the effort. And what that means in practical terms is that the window for you to make a disclosure through controlled channels is narrowing fast. If Rael's people find you before you transmit..." He stopped. "The drive doesn't survive that, and neither, likely, do you." She looked at the laptop, at the photograph of Thomas Ferraro standing in a Detroit parking lot beside the man who had spent 14 months methodically dismantling the organization she'd spent 6 years quietly protecting. "I need to call the federal contact," she said. "Yes. Tonight." "Yes. I have a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Northern District who I've been maintaining for this purpose. I can have a secure call set up within the hour, but Vivian..." He paused. "What's on that drive is going to implicate Ferraro directly, and Ferraro's records, when they're fully examined, will show the financial architecture of the Moretti organization in detail that's going to cause serious problems for Damien." She looked up. "I know that. You're comfortable with that outcome. I'm not comfortable with any of this." Her voice was level. "But I didn't build that record to protect Damien from consequences. I built it to protect him from Rael. The distinction matters. Whatever legal exposure comes from the financial architecture, that's separate from what I'm disclosing. I'm disclosing Rael's operation, Rael's crimes. What the government does with the adjacencies is not something I can control." Vasquez looked at her for a moment. "You understand that this will likely cost him the organization?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "I understand that. And you're still..." "Set up the call," she said. Damien was in the air when Marcus told him about Ferraro. He'd chartered a plane at 1 in the morning. Small, fast, the kind of aircraft his organization maintained specifically for situations that required speed over comfort. And he was 40 minutes out of Indianapolis when Marcus called with the specific tone of voice that Damien had learned, over 20 years, meant the information was bad enough that Marcus had spent time deciding how to say it before picking up the phone. "Talk," Damien said. "Ferraro." Just the name. A pause. "He's been with Rael for at least 14 months, probably longer. He's the inside layer on the financial bleed, the intelligence package on Vivian. He had access to the communication monitoring we had running on the organization's network, which means he was the one who saw what Vivian was building on that drive and told Rael it existed." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Damien didn't move. He sat in the narrow cabin seat with the phone at his ear and felt something move through him that wasn't expressible in any form he had ready access to. Not anger. Anger was too simple, too immediate, too reactive for what this was. This was the specific devastation of a man who has realized that the structure he'd been living inside, the architecture of loyalty and function he'd spent 2 decades building, testing, reinforcing, had been hollow at a load-bearing point for longer than he'd been paying attention. 9 years. Thomas Ferraro, the man who knew every number, who sat at every audit table, who had access to every holding structure, every routing channel, every financial instrument the organization operated through. 9 years. "Where is he now?" Damien said. "Chicago, his apartment. We have eyes on him." A pause. "Damien, we need him intact. If we move on him before..." "I know." His voice came out quieter than he intended. "I know. Don't touch him." "There's something else." He waited. "The contact Vivian is working with. Leon Vasquez. I've been running him for the last 6 hours, and he's exactly what he appears to be. Burned intelligence contractor, personal operation, legitimate reasons for being in this. But he reached out to a federal contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office 2 hours ago. Another pause. I think she's going to make a disclosure tonight. Damien processed that. Outside the plane's window, the dark was absolute. No city lights yet, just the particular nothing of Midwestern sky at altitude. She's going to hand what's on the drive to the feds, he said. It looks that way. And when they pull on that thread, the financial architecture comes with it. Yeah. Marcus didn't dress it up. Some of it stays clean. She built the record specifically around Rael's operations, not ours, and Vasquez seems to have counseled her toward targeted disclosure. But the adjacencies are going to get attention. The feds don't have a history of stopping at the edges of what they're handed. Damien sat with that. The plane was descending now, the pressure change subtle in his ears. Indianapolis below somewhere, invisible through the cloud layer. She's doing it anyway, he said. Damien, she's doing it anyway, even knowing what it costs. He stopped, something compressed in his chest that he didn't examine. She left everything I offered her. She disappeared clean. She spent 3 months building her own operation and making her own contacts and protecting herself completely independently. And now she's about to hand the one thing that could protect her to the federal government, even knowing it damages the organization. He paused. Because she decided Rael needs to be ended more than she needs leverage. That's what it looks like, yeah. He was quiet for a long time. I spent 2 months, he said slowly, believing she was working against me. I had papers signed. I had it decided. And the entire time, he stopped, breathed. The entire time she was the only person in the organization who was actually watching the right direction. Marcus didn't answer. There was nothing useful to say to that, and Marcus Webb had survived as long as he had, partly because he knew exactly when silence was the only appropriate response. The plane broke through the cloud layer. Below, the city appeared, ordinary, vast, indifferent, gridded with light. I'm landing in 20 minutes, Damien said. I need Vasquez's location. I'm working on it. Work faster. He ended the call and looked out the window at the city coming up beneath him and thought about a woman in that city who was sitting in some anonymous location doing something he could not have predicted and would not have expected. And that was, he understood now with the clarity of something that had taken too long to arrive, entirely characteristic of who she had always been, who he had failed to see clearly for 6 years. The plane descended. The federal call lasted 47 minutes. Vasquez's contact, a woman named Adler, assistant U.S. attorney, voiced like someone who had not been surprised by anything since 2009, asked precise questions and received precise answers, and at the end of it requested a 48-hour window to verify the preliminary documentation against existing investigative records before formalizing a disclosure agreement. I don't have 48 hours, Vivian said. Then give me 24 and understand that the agreement won't be fully formalized within that window. What does that mean for my protection? It means you have my word that the office will act in good faith on what you've provided, which is worth more than a piece of paper that isn't signed yet. A pause. Ms. Hale, what you've described, if it holds up to the initial verification, represents the most significant intelligence on Holloway syndicate operations we've had access to in 7 years. This office has active interest in seeing this processed correctly. That's as close to a guarantee as I can give you tonight. Vivian looked at Vasquez across the table. He gave her the very slight nod of someone who has worked with this contact before and is indicating that the word is in fact good. 24 hours, Vivian said. I'll expect contact by noon tomorrow. You'll have it. She ended the call, set the phone on the table, sat in the warehouse quiet for a moment, and felt the weight of the last several hours settle into her body in a way that she'd been preventing by staying in motion. And now that the motion had stopped, the weight was significant. Vasquez poured her a cup of coffee from a thermos he'd produced from somewhere. She drank it without comment. It's done, he said. The disclosure is started. It's not done. She set the cup down. Rael still has people in this city. Reyes and Cho can move you to the Ohio property tonight. You'd be off the grid by morning. She was quiet for a moment. Tell me what you're not saying. He looked at her steadily. The secondary leak in Damien's circle. I've been running the analysis for the last 2 hours. The timing of the call, the relay speed, the position data they'd have needed to put the second vehicle where it was. He paused. It's not Marcus Webb. Then who? Someone in the physical security detail, someone who was in the room when Damien made the call and had access to the location data on your number. He laced his hands on the table. I think Rael had a backup layer inside the security team that was specifically activated when the financial and intelligence operation started degrading. Someone who could report on Damien's movements and communications in real time. Vivian absorbed that. So even if I'm clear of Indianapolis, anyone Damien sends to you, any contact he makes, is potentially a vector as long as the leak is active. Vasquez paused. He needs to know. He needs to be told tonight, before he does anything. He's already on his way here. She said it without inflection. She could see from Vasquez's lack of surprise that he'd already figured that out. You knew he'd come. I assumed. He's not the kind of man who stays in Chicago when He stopped. When there's something he can act on. She looked at the table, the coffee cup, the laptop with its silent feeds. Outside the warehouse, Indianapolis was conducting its ordinary late-night business. Trucks on the interstate, the distant rhythm of a city that had no awareness of and no stake in the specific wreckage being sorted through in this room. He needs to know about the leak before he makes another move, she said. Yes. Which means I need to talk to him. Yes. And I can't do that from a secure channel because the secure channel is what burned me last time. No. You'd need to do it in person, or not at all. He paused. The Ohio property is the safest place for that conversation. If we move you there tonight and he redirects to Ohio, we can verify his travel security en route and identify the leak before he arrives. She stood up. Her back ached. It had been aching for hours. The particular low ache of late pregnancy combined with too much time in a car and too much adrenaline metabolizing through a body that was simultaneously trying to run an operation and grow a human being. She pressed her fist against the small of her back and breathed through it. Get the car ready, she said. Ohio. Reyes moved. She went to the bathroom at the back of the warehouse, small, industrial, a concrete floor and a single bulb, and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the scratched metal that served as a mirror. The reflection was imprecise, blurred around the edges. The face looking back at her was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't entirely fix, and her hair still had traces of safety glass caught in it that she'd missed, and she was 25 weeks pregnant and alone in a warehouse in Indianapolis at 2 a.m. after filing a federal disclosure that was going to cost the man who'd signed her out of his life the empire he'd spent 20 years building. She thought about whether she felt anything specific about that. She did. She felt quite a lot about it, compressed into a form she didn't have time or space to examine right now. She filed it. She was good at filing things. She dried her hands, went back out. Reyes was by the door. Cho had the SUV running in the loading bay. Vasquez was on his phone, speaking in a low voice, directing something she couldn't hear. She picked up her bag. She checked the lining of her coat. The drive, still there, the small hard rectangle of 4 years of work. And then she followed Reyes toward the bay door. They were 6 feet from the SUV when the loading bay's external door opened, not from the inside, from the outside. The mechanism turned from the other direction, which meant a key, which meant someone who was supposed to have access, and the door swung open and 3 men came in fast and low with the practiced entry pattern of people who do this as a matter of routine, and the loading bay lights caught the face of the man in front, and Vivian recognized him. Not from Rael's people, from Damien's. His name was Carter. He ran point on Damien's primary security detail. She'd seen him 100 times in 6 years, outside the Astor Street house, in the lobby of the Wacker building, at the table near the door at every dinner that required a protective presence. She knew his face the way you know the furniture in a room you've spent years in. He looked at her with an expression that was doing its best to be professional and not entirely succeeding. Mrs. Moretti, he said. Mr. Moretti sent us to bring you to him. Vasquez had appeared at her shoulder. Reyes was between her and Carter, hand near his jacket. "How did you find this location?" Vasquez said. Carter's eyes stayed on Vivian. Mr. Moretti tracked the phone. The phone was on a secure channel. He had the hardware location data, different from the call routing. Carter's jaw tightened slightly. "We're not here to create a problem. Mr. Moretti's 20 minutes out. He wants to meet." Vivian looked at Carter, at the two men behind him, both familiar, both part of the regular detail, both doing the things security people do when they're waiting for a situation to resolve, which is standing very still and breathing in a way that suggests they're ready to stop standing still immediately. And then she looked at the third man she didn't know. That was wrong. She knew the detail. She'd spent 6 years knowing the detail, knowing the rotations and the faces and the specific personnel that Damien trusted at various proximity levels. A face she didn't recognize in this configuration, at this hour, in this level of operational sensitivity, was wrong, in a way that registered as physical sensation before her mind had fully articulated the problem. "Who is that?" she said. Carter glanced back. "Back up." Damien pulled an extra when, "I know your detail," she said. "I know every rotation. I have known every person in the primary security operation for 5 years. Who is that man?" Carter's face did something she couldn't entirely read. A flicker. Something behind the professional surface. Vasquez said very quietly, "Vivian." She was already moving. Not away. That was the thing that would define it later. The moment she'd returned to, she moved toward Carter because away was the loading bay door and unknown ground. And the third man was between her and the external exit, and everything in her body said, "Don't let him get behind you." Carter put his hand up. "Mrs. Moretti, get away from me." She said it at Carter, but she was watching the third man, and the third man was watching her with a stillness that had gone from passive to deliberate in the 3 seconds since she'd identified him as wrong. He had his hand at his jacket, and Reyes had his hand at his jacket, and Vasquez was saying something low and fast into his phone. And then Carter said, "Doyle, stand down," to the third man, and Doyle did not stand down, and that was the moment the situation resolved itself into its actual shape. Doyle's hand came out of his jacket. Reyes moved, fast, trained, interposing between Doyle and Vivian in a single step, and what happened in the next 4 seconds was loud and catastrophic and over before her mind caught up with it. And when it was over, Reyes was on the ground and Doyle was running for the external door, and Carter was standing with his hands up, and Vasquez was beside her with his hand on her arm, saying her name, saying it clearly and directly, like someone trying to keep a signal alive through interference. She looked at Reyes on the ground. He was alive. Cho was already with him. Not a kill shot. Doyle had been in a hurry, and the angle was bad, and Reyes was trained to move. And what it was going to be was serious without being fatal, but it was going to need attention immediately, and they were in an industrial warehouse in Indianapolis at 2 a.m. And the one thing they did not have was time. "Cho," Vasquez said, "get him stable. Carter." He turned on Carter with the controlled fury of a man who has been running this operation for 8 months and has just watched it almost come apart in a loading bay. "Talk. Right now. Who brought Doyle in?" Carter's face was bad. He looked like a man who has just watched the situation he was in reveal itself as significantly more complicated than the one he thought he'd been sent to resolve. "He was added to the detail 3 weeks ago. Someone above my authorization level. I was told he cleared the standard vetting." "Who authorized it?" Carter's jaw worked. "The authorization came through the consigliere's channel. Marcus Webb." Vasquez and Vivian looked at each other. Marcus Webb. She thought about Damien's voice on the phone, the quality of it when the control had dropped out. The repetition of her name in the dark like something being held on to. She thought about whether Damien knew, and understood immediately from the construction of the situation that he didn't. That nobody who knew Damien Moretti would willingly hand him a version of events where his oldest surviving relationship was the source of the leak that had put his pregnant wife in a warehouse firefight in Indianapolis. And she thought about the plane. 20 minutes out, landing in Indianapolis with the full knowledge that the call he'd made to her had been the trigger that brought Riel's people to her parking lot, carrying the specific guilt of that without yet knowing that the leak in his circle had a name he would recognize. Marcus Webb. 20 years. She'd watched them together 100 times. The particular shorthand of men who'd been dangerous together since before either of them had fully understood what dangerous meant. The way Damien deferred to Marcus on exactly the categories of decision where Damien's own blind spots were most significant. The trust that was so deep it had stopped looking like trust and just looked like the air. And Marcus Webb had put a man named Doyle into the security detail 3 weeks ago, and Doyle had been in the room when Damien called her, and Doyle had relayed her position to Rael's people, and Reyes was on the floor of a warehouse because of the chain of events that started with that relay. She pressed her hand flat against the coat, against the drive, against the son who was, against all probability, still moving with his ordinary unconscious persistence beneath everything. "Call Damien," she said to Vasquez. Her voice was very level. "Tell him to pull over. Tell him not to contact Marcus until he's talked to me. Tell him—" She paused, breathed. "Tell him the name he needs to hear before he lands is Marcus Webb." Vasquez looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who understands the weight of what is being asked of him. Then he picked up the phone. Across the loading bay, Cho was working on Reyes with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this before in worse conditions, and Carter was standing with his hands still up and the expression of a man who has just understood that the organization he works for has a problem he cannot solve by standing still. And outside the warehouse, Indianapolis went about its ignorant business, and somewhere in the dark above it all, a small, chartered plane was beginning its descent toward a city that was about to receive a man in the precise moment of understanding that the person who had spent 20 years closest to him had been, for some unknowable duration, looking at him from the other side of a line that Damien Moretti had believed, until this moment, did not exist inside his own house. The phone rang twice before Damien picked up. Vasquez said his name, then said, "Before you land, before you do anything, there's something you need to hear." And Damien Moretti, 41 years old, in a small plane descending toward a city he'd spent 3 months not knowing his wife was in, said, "Tell me." And the telling of it was going to change the shape of everything that came after, because there are betrayals that hurt, and there are betrayals that restructure, that reach into the load-bearing places and pull, and leave the man standing in the rubble trying to remember which parts of the structure were ever actually real. And what Vasquez was about to say was the second kind. The kind that doesn't leave clean damage. The kind that makes a man who has never once in his adult life been uncertain of who he was stand in the middle of what he's built and wonder whether any of it was ever built on ground that was actually his. The plane landed at 2:47 in the morning. Damien was off it before the wheels had fully stopped rolling, moving across the tarmac with the particular economy of a man who has compressed something enormous into a very small space and is operating entirely on the energy of keeping it compressed. The cold hit him. Indianapolis in November. Same brutal logic as Chicago. The wind off nothing in particular, carrying the same message it always carried this time of year, which was that comfort was a seasonal arrangement and the season was over. Carter met him at the edge of the tarmac. One look at Carter's face told him that Vasquez had already delivered the preliminary version. Carter had the expression of a man who has been part of a chain of events he didn't fully understand until the chain became visible and now cannot stop seeing it. "Where is she?" Damien said. "Warehouse. West side. Vasquez has the location." Carter fell into step beside him. "Damien, I didn't know about Doyle. I need you to understand. I know you didn't." He said it without looking at Carter. Not absolution, just fact. Delivered efficiently, because he didn't have processing space for Carter's guilt right now. "Is Reyes stable?" Cho says yes, through and through on the left shoulder. He needs a hospital, but Vasquez is holding off until they move locations. "And Vivian?" "Physically intact." A pause. "She's—" Carter stopped. "Say it." "She's not what I expected, that's all." Damien got in the car. The driver, one of 2 men he'd brought from Chicago, men whose full histories he'd personally verified in the 12 hours since Vasquez's call, men whose authorization chains he'd traced himself back to their origins, pulled out without being told to. Damien sat in the back and looked at the Indianapolis skyline going past and thought about Marcus Webb. He'd been thinking about Marcus Webb since Vasquez said the name. He'd been thinking about it with the specific quality of attention that happened when the mind encounters something it cannot immediately metabolize, something that sits outside every existing category and waits, with the patience of an irrefutable fact, for the categories to rearrange themselves around it. 20 years. He and Marcus had been 21 years old when the organization first took them seriously as something other than peripheral labor. Marcus had been in the room for every significant decision Damien had made in 2 decades. He'd been in the room for the decisions that couldn't be documented, the ones that determined the shape of everything that came after. He knew where everybody was buried, literally, in 3 cases. He knew the names that never appeared in any record. He knew the full architecture of everything Damien had built, had helped build it, had been the person Damien called when a situation was too sensitive for anyone else. When Vivian's intelligence package arrived, Marcus had been the one who said it seemed credible, had been careful about it, hadn't pushed, hadn't advocated strongly, had let Damien process it and reach his own conclusions the way a good consigliere does. Hadn't needed to push, because he knew Damien well enough to know that presenting the information clearly and then stepping back was more effective than arguing for a conclusion. Had known, with 20 years of intimate knowledge of exactly how Damien's mind worked, precisely how much weight to put on each piece of the fabrication and where to put it. The car moved through Indianapolis. The streets were empty and the lights were the dull amber of late-night municipal infrastructure, and Damien looked out the window and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could accurately measure. He felt genuinely lost. Not tactically, not strategically. In some more fundamental way. The way that happens when the person you used as a compass has been pointing you in the wrong direction long enough that you can no longer identify which way is north. He pressed his hand flat against his knee. He breathed. He filed it. Later. All of it. Later. Right now, there was Vivian in a warehouse in Rael somewhere in the city, running an operation that now knew she'd made federal contact, and a man named Marcus Webb, who was in Chicago, and didn't yet know that his name had been said out loud in a loading bay in Indianapolis, and was about to become the organizing fact of the next several hours. One thing at a time. The car stopped. Thump. The warehouse looked like nothing. That was the point. Damien went in through the loading bay, and the first person he saw was Vasquez, standing near the table with the laptop, watching him come in with the evaluating stillness of a man who makes rapid assessments of new variables as a matter of professional habit. They looked at each other for a moment. "Thank you," Damien said, "for staying with her." Vasquez nodded once. Not warm, not cold, professional. "She's the one who stayed with herself. I provided logistics." He gestured toward the back of the warehouse. "She's aware you're here. She asked for 5 minutes." Damien looked at the back of the warehouse, at the door that led to whatever space she was in. He thought about the 5 minutes and about the fact that she'd asked for them and about everything those 5 minutes represented. The precise amount of time a woman needs to decide what version of herself she's going to be when she walks into a conversation she's been not thinking about for 3 months. He walked to the door, knocked once, waited. "Come in," she said. It was a small office, a desk, 2 chairs, a space heater running in the corner that had taken the temperature from warehouse cold to marginally inhabitable. She was standing when he came in, not sitting, which he understood immediately as a deliberate choice. She wasn't going to receive him from a chair. She was going to be on her feet, equal ground, no dynamic that required her to look up. He stopped inside the door. She looked at him across the small room, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment that had several layers running through it simultaneously. The 3 months, the papers, the pregnancy that was no longer something abstract in a confirmation document, but physically present and undeniable in the way she stood and held herself. And Damien Moretti, who had conducted negotiations with men who wanted him dead while maintaining complete surface composure, felt the specific inadequacy of every word he knew. "You look tired," he said finally. It was a terrible opening, and he knew it immediately. "I've been awake for 22 hours, and someone shot out my back window," she said. Tired is accurate. He looked at her. At the coat still buttoned over everything, at the tiredness in her face that was real and deep and of a different quality than operational fatigue, the kind that lives in bone rather than muscle. Are you hurt? No. The baby. Fine. Moving. Her voice was level. Damien, I know why you're here and I understand the impulse and I need you to hear what I'm going to say before we do anything else. I'm listening. She looked at him directly. He'd always known, a way of looking at people that was different from how most people look. No performance in it, no management of impression, just the clear, sustained attention of someone who has decided to see what's actually in front of them. He'd found it disconcerting when they first met, and had learned to find it valuable, and had then, he understood now, with the sour clarity of delayed recognition, taken it so completely for granted that he'd stopped noticing when it was aimed at him. Marcus, she said. I know. He's been in this from the beginning, not just the leak tonight, the full operation. The intelligence package, the fabrication. He is the reason you signed those papers. She paused. And I need to know what you're going to do about that before you do it, because whatever you do is going to either close this situation permanently or tear everything open in a way that brings down what's left of the organization on top of the federal disclosure I've already made. He looked at her steadily. What did you disclose? Rael's operation, financial trails, transaction records, 14 months of his Eastern Network's activity, Ferraro's connection to Rael, the full architecture of how the Holloway Syndicate was planning to absorb what you built. She paused. I targeted it as specifically as I could. The adjacencies to your operation are going to get attention. I couldn't prevent that, and I won't pretend I tried very hard. But the primary exposure is Rael's. You understood what it would cost when you made the call. Yes. And you made it anyway. Yes. Something in her face, not apology, not defiance, just the flat honesty of someone stating the terms of a decision they've already fully committed to. I didn't build that record to protect your empire, Damien. I built it because Rael was going to destroy you, and I'd spent 4 years watching him build toward it, and I wasn't going to let that happen. What happens legally after, that's separate. That's consequence, not intention. He was quiet for a moment. The space heater ran in the corner. Outside the thin walls of the office, the warehouse was quiet. You protected me for 4 years, he said, without telling me. You wouldn't have accepted it if I'd told you. No accusation, just fact. You would have taken it over, redirected it, converted it into an asset you controlled rather than a parallel system that could operate in blind spots you didn't know you had. She looked at him. I know how you work. He didn't argue with that. She was right, and they both knew she was right, and there was something humiliating in being known that accurately by the person you'd spent 2 months believing was working against you. Marcus is in Chicago, he said. I know. He doesn't know yet that his name has been identified. I know that too. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you think I should do? She looked slightly surprised. Not much, just a flicker, gone quickly. He'd never asked her that before. Not in 6 years. He'd asked her to review things, to evaluate things, to confirm things he'd already decided, but the direct question with the full weight of genuine openness behind it was new, and she recognized it as new, and she took a moment before she answered. Don't go back to Chicago tonight, she said. Let me contact Adler, the U.S. attorney, and add Marcus to what I've already given them. Let the federal apparatus handle it. If you go back to Chicago and confront him personally, he'll know I'm coming. He'll know the moment you land. He's been in your circle for 20 years. He knows how you move. She held his eyes. And if he panics, he'll make contact with Rael. And Rael will know the full operation has been exposed. And whatever he does with that knowledge in the next 12 hours, she stopped. Rael still has people in this city looking for me. If he knows the disclosure is done and Marcus is burned and the whole structure is coming down, he has nothing to lose. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous version of this problem. Damien looked at her for a long time. His jaw was tight, and the muscle along it moved in the way it moved when he was working very hard to be rational about something that was not generating a rational response in him. You're telling me to let someone else handle Marcus Webb. I'm telling you that you handling Marcus Webb personally in the next 12 hours is the outcome Conrad Rael most needs in order to survive what I've already done to him tonight. Her voice was steady and very clear. So yes, He turned away, walked 2 steps to the wall and stood there for a moment with his back to her and his hand flat against the bare concrete and his breathing the kind of controlled that takes real effort. She watched him, didn't speak. He turned back. "Okay," he said. She looked at him carefully, reading the word, reading what was underneath it. "Okay, meaning you're right, and I know you're right, and I am going to need approximately 30 seconds to finish hating that before I can work with it constructively." He said it with the particular stripped bluntness of a man who has run out of the energy to manage his own presentation. "Give me that." She gave him that. 28 seconds later, he said, "Call Adler, add Marcus. Then tell me what we need to do about Rael's people in this city tonight." What they needed to do about Rael's people in this city tonight was the question that had been running underneath everything else, and the answer to it arrived in the form of a phone call to Vasquez at 3:15 in the morning from a contact whose name Vasquez didn't share, but whose information was, based on his reaction, both credible and bad. He came into the office without knocking, looked at both of them. "Rael is here," he said. "Not operationally, physically. He landed at the private terminal an hour ago." A pause. "And he's not here for Vivian." Damien went very still. "He's here for the drive," Vasquez said. "He knows the disclosure was made. Someone in the U.S. Attorney's office, not Adler, someone further out on the chain, made a call within an hour of Vivian's contact. Rael has a source in the federal building." He looked at Damien. "He knows the disclosure won't hold without the primary documentation. The federal agreement requires the physical drive to be examined and verified before the disclosure is legally actionable. If he gets the drive before it's handed over, the disclosure falls apart," Damien said. "The disclosure becomes unverifiable. Without the source documentation, everything Vivian gave Adler is secondhand intelligence with no evidentiary foundation. The defense attorneys dismantle it in pretrial." Vasquez's voice was flat and tight. "He doesn't need to find Vivian anymore. He needs the drive." Vivian reached into the lining of her coat without speaking, pulled out the drive, set it on the desk between them. All three of them looked at it. A small thing, black, rectangular, the kind of component that cost $40 at any electronics store and looked like nothing in a coat pocket and had taken her 4 years to fill with the kind of information that could dismantle an empire. "When does Adler need it physically?" Vivian said. "She asked for delivery to the federal building by 9 a.m. That's 5.5 hours. Vasquez looked at both of them. "Rael has people in this city who know what we're driving and have been tracking movement in this area for the last 3 hours. Getting from here to the federal building is not a simple proposition." "Does he know this location?" Damien said. "Not yet. But Doyle got out of the building before Reyes went down. He's been dark since then, which means he's either reporting or he's running, and given what he knows about where we were..." Vasquez didn't finish that. He didn't need to. Damien looked at Vivian. She was looking at the drive on the desk with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not fear, something older and more resolved than fear, the face of someone who has made every decision that leads to this moment and is now simply present in it. "How many vehicles does Vasquez's team have?" Damien said. "2 operational. Reyes is down." "My 2 men from Chicago plus Carter. That's 3 security personnel plus you and me." He was already calculating, already mapping the problem into components. "We need a route to the federal building that accounts for..." "How many vehicles does Rael currently have in play?" "Last confirmed count was 4. That was 90 minutes ago." "So assume 6, possibly more." He pulled out his phone, opened a map. Indianapolis at 3 in the morning. Limited traffic, limited cover, the grid of the city laid out in the clean geometry of Midwestern urban planning, wide streets, and predictable intersections, and very few of the natural choke points that a city like Chicago provided. He'll try to intercept en route. He needs the physical drive before 9 a.m., and he knows where we need to go. "We could split," Vasquez said. "Multiple vehicles, different routes, decoy. He has more vehicles than we do. Splitting reduces the protective concentration around the drive." Damien shook his head. "1 convoy, direct route, speed over concealment." He looked up. "Is there anything between here and the federal building that gives him a natural intercept point?" Vasquez pulled up his own map. "The bridge on West Washington Street. Single lane in each direction at this hour, construction narrowing on the east side. If he knows we're coming that direction, he'll know whatever direction we're coming. Damien set the phone down. We go through it fast. No slowing at the construction, no stopping regardless of what's in the road. He looked at Carter. Your lead vehicle. You stop for nothing. Carter nodded. He looked like a man who had spent 3 hours doing the math on his own culpability and had arrived at the conclusion that the only available payment was performance. Understood. Cho? He looked at Vivian's man. Is Reyes stable enough to be moved? He needs a hospital, Cho said from the doorway. But he can travel. He travels with us. I'm not leaving anyone in this building. He looked at Vivian. You're in the center vehicle. Vasquez and I are with you. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has already decided not to argue with the tactical logic, but wants it noted that she hasn't surrendered the argument in principle. Fine. The drive goes in your coat, where it's been. He paused. Don't give it to anyone except Adler personally. Not a deputy, not an assistant, Adler. I know how to do this. I know you do. He said it simply, without the edge she'd been expecting. Just acknowledgement, clean and direct. I'm saying it because it's important, not because I think you need to be told. She picked up the drive, looked at it for a moment, put it back in the coat. The space heater ran. The warehouse was quiet. Let's go, Damien said. They left at 3:34. 3 vehicles. Carter leading in the SUV that Cho had driven from the parking structure, with 2 of Damien's Chicago men. Center vehicle. Damien's chartered car, large and dark, carrying Vasquez, Vivian, Reyes propped in the back seat with his shoulder packed and his face the gray-white of someone running on the residual energy of shock. Third vehicle with Carter's remaining security covering the rear. Indianapolis at 3:30 in the morning was empty in the particular way of mid-size American cities at that hour. Not threatening empty, just human absent, the streets clean and wide and lit with the amber indifference of infrastructure that runs regardless. They made the first 6 blocks in 2 minutes without incident, and Damien sat in the front passenger seat of the center vehicle and watched the city going past and watched the mirrors simultaneously and felt, in his chest, the particular compression of a situation that has been building toward a single point for long enough that the point itself, when it arrives, is almost a relief. The radio in the car crackled. Carter's voice. Vehicle on our 6, 2 blocks back, matching speed. Damien checked the side mirror. Dark sedan. Standard. Nothing unusual about it except that at 3:30 in the morning on an empty Indianapolis street, matching speed with a 3-car convoy meant making a decision to do so. 2, he said into the radio. Possibly more. Don't react. Copy. They continued. The federal building was 11 minutes at current speed. 7 if they pushed it. Damien did the arithmetic and concluded that pushing it was the right call. Accelerate, he told the driver. Not dramatic, just consistent. Get us there in 7. The driver accelerated. The convoy maintained its spacing. The dark sedan behind them accelerated too, and then a second vehicle appeared from a cross street 2 blocks ahead. Not blocking, not yet, just present and moving with the same deliberate calculation that communicated purpose without showing it yet. Carter's voice. Second vehicle, ahead left. We have a pincer developing. I see it. Damien's voice was very flat. Maintain speed. Do not slow for the construction on Washington. Copy. Bridge in 90 seconds. Vivian was in the back seat beside Reyes, one hand on the grip above the door, the other pressed flat against her side in the way she did when she needed to locate the physical reality of the child beneath everything else. She was watching the mirrors. She wasn't speaking. Her breathing was controlled and even, and Damien could hear it in the car's interior silence and felt something complicated about that. The specific steadiness of a woman who has been in dangerous situations before and has a learned response to them that looks like calm and is actually something more disciplined than calm. The bridge, Vasquez said from the back. I know. The bridge on West Washington Street came up in the headlights. The construction narrowing on the east side visible as orange barriers and warning lights, and a single lane of passage that required a slight angle of approach. Carter's SUV hit it without slowing, and the second vehicle ahead moved directly into the bridge's entry point, blocking it. Not a collision, positioned, sitting perpendicular across the entry lane with its lights off. Carter's voice, without inflection. "We've got a blocker on the bridge. What do you want?" 1 second. 2. The dark sedan behind them had closed the gap to half a block. The vehicle ahead left was accelerating toward the bridge approach from the side. "Go through it," Damien said. "The blocker—" "Go through it." Carter went through it. The SUV hit the blocking vehicle at the left rear panel. Not full speed, controlled, enough force to push it clear of the lane with the kind of impact that registered as a full-body jolt through the following vehicles. And then they were on the bridge, single lane, concrete barriers on both sides, the river below black and moving, and the three-vehicle convoy was through before the pursuit vehicles could reconfigure. The car behind them took the bridge at speed. The vehicle ahead left was repositioning. Damien watched the mirror. "They're going to try to get ahead of us," he said. "Parallel street. They know where we're going." 2 minutes to the Federal Building, the driver said. 2 minutes was a geometry problem. The pursuit vehicles had to get around the bridge's single-lane configuration, had to navigate the construction, had to find a parallel route that brought them to the Federal Building's approach before the convoy arrived. Damien calculated the distances in his head. The available parallel streets, the traffic signals, the time advantage the bridge maneuver had bought them. Enough. Barely. "Push it," he said. "All the way. Go." The driver went. The convoy accelerated through the pre-dawn streets of Indianapolis, 70 miles an hour on streets designed for 40, the three vehicles moving in close formation through amber light and empty intersection after empty intersection, and Damien watched ahead and watched behind and felt the particular physical reality of the situation in his hands, which were pressing against his knees with a force he wasn't consciously directing, and in his chest, where the compression had become something almost structural, a weight he was breathing around rather than through. 1 minute out. Damien's radio crackled. Then a voice he hadn't been expecting, not Carter, not his men, a voice that said, very clearly, very calmly, "Damien, stop the convoy." Marcus Webb, on the convoy's operational channel. Every vehicle in the convoy heard it simultaneously. Carter's SUV didn't slow. Carter was good enough and motivated enough to keep moving regardless. But Damien felt the ripple of it through the communication system, felt the particular horror of hearing a compromised voice on a channel that was supposed to be secure. He picked up the radio. "Marcus? Stop the convoy. I'm asking you. You're asking me." He said it with a quietness that had nothing to do with calm. "You're on my operational channel at 3:40 in the morning asking me to stop. There are things you don't understand yet about why, tell me where you are." A pause. "That's not... Tell me where you are, Marcus." Another pause. Then, with the specific flatness of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just felt the last of the structure holding it up give way. "I'm in Indianapolis. I've been here since midnight." Damien looked at the Federal Building coming up ahead. The building's exterior lights visible 3 blocks ahead. The approach clear, 45 seconds away. "You came here yourself," he said. "Yes." "Why?" The pause was longer this time, long enough that the convoy covered another half block before the answer came. "Because I knew you'd come for her," Marcus said, "and I needed to see whether you were going to make it." The words landed with a quality that Damien could not immediately organize. Not threat, not instruction. Something else, something that had grief in it, deeply compressed, the kind that lives under everything a person does for long enough that it becomes invisible to them. "Marcus, there's a vehicle on your left, white panel van. It's Rael's, ma." His last play, he repositioned when the bridge didn't hold. He has one shot at the approach and he's taking it. A pause. Breathing. "I see it from where I'm standing. Left side, 40 yards. Damien looked left. The van was there. White, angled, accelerating from a side street toward the convoy's approach path. "Carter," Damien said into the radio. "White van, Left, 40 yards. Do not let it reach the center vehicle. Carter was already moving. The lead SUV cut left, an aggressive lane change forcing itself between the van and the convoy's center, and the van's driver had a choice between hitting the SUV head-on or aborting, and made the choice a person makes when they're running an operation rather than executing a personal vendetta, which was to abort and peel away rather than destroy the vehicle and its occupants in a collision that would bring every emergency service in Indianapolis to this block in 4 minutes. The convoy hit the federal building's approach clear. Carter's voice. "We're clear." 30 seconds. Damien exhaled. It was not a sound he made consciously. It came out of him the way sounds come when the body has been holding something against its own instincts, and the instincts finally prevail. He looked at the radio in his hand, at the operational channel that Marcus Webb had been on. "Marcus, are you still there?" Static. Then, "Yes." "Stay where you are." He paused. "I'm going to come to you when this is done. Tonight." Another pause. "Don't run." The longest silence yet. "I won't run," Marcus said. The convoy pulled into the federal building's secured approach. The driver stopped. Damien got out. He walked to the center vehicle and opened the rear door, and Vivian was already moving, already out, standing on the pavement in front of the federal building in the pre-dawn dark with her coat buttoned and her hair still carrying traces of safety glass, and her face carrying the sustained exhaustion of a night that had required her to be every version of herself simultaneously. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Adler is inside," Vasquez said from behind them. "She came in when we confirmed we were moving." Vivian reached into the lining of her coat. The drive. She held it for a moment, flat in her palm, small and dark, and carrying 4 years of work she'd done in silence, while no one who should have been looking was looking. "I'll walk you in," Damien said. She looked at him, the complex evaluation of that look, what it contained, what it was measuring. Then she said, "Okay." They walked in together. The federal building's lobby at 3:55 in the morning was lit with the particular institutional brightness of a place that runs regardless of hour. A security desk, a guard who checked their identification with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been told to expect this and had decided professional normalcy was the appropriate response to whatever this was. Adler was waiting on the 4th floor. Vivian had described her as having a voice like someone unsurprisable, and when Damien saw her, 50s, sharp-faced, standing in the hallway outside a conference room with a legal pad and a coffee she was actually drinking, he understood the description. She looked at both of them. Her eyes went briefly to Vivian's midsection, then back up, with the quick recalibration of someone updating a file. "Ms. Hale," she said. "Adler." Vivian held out the drive. "There's an additional name on the disclosure. Marcus Webb, consigliere to the Moretti organization. He's been running a secondary information channel to Rael's operation for an undetermined period. The documentation on the drive includes financial communication records that will connect him to the transfer anomalies in the Moretti holding structures. I had those flagged separately because at the time I wasn't certain of the source, but the pattern is there." She paused. "There's also a federal source. Someone in your building made a call within an hour of our initial contact tonight that reached Rael's operation. You need to find that before morning." Adler looked at her for a long moment, took the drive. "Anything else?" "That's everything." Adler looked at Damien, a long, evaluating look that communicated several things without saying any of them. Then she said, "Mr. Moretti, you should know that whatever happens procedurally from this disclosure, the cooperation extended here will be part of the record." He looked at her steadily. "I understand." She nodded once, turned, walked into the conference room. The door closed. Vivian and Damien stood in the hallway. The institutional lights ran overhead. The building was quiet around them. Down the hall, a clock on the wall said 4:02 in the morning. She sat down on the bench against the wall. Not graceful about it, just sat, the way a person does when the adrenaline has been running for 6 hours, and the body presents the bill in the form of a sudden and comprehensive unwillingness to remain upright without support. She pressed her hands against her knees and breathed, and Damien stood in front of her and did not speak. After a moment, he sat down beside her. Not close, not crowding, just present. They sat in the hallway of the federal building at 4 in the morning, and neither of them said anything for a while. And outside, Indianapolis was beginning the very earliest stage of becoming daytime. Not light yet, not even close, but some quality of the darkness shifting. The particular atmospheric change that happens in the hour before dawn when the night starts to realize it's running out of time. Inside Vivian's coat, where the drive had been for 4 years, was now just the coat. She thought about that, about what it felt like to have carried something for that long and then set it down. She didn't have an immediate answer. The feeling was still organizing itself. Beside her, Damien was sitting with his hands on his knees and his jaw tight, and the muscle along it doing the thing it did. And somewhere in Indianapolis, on a street she didn't know, in a location she hadn't been told, standing or sitting in the dark, and waiting for the thing he'd said he'd do when this was done, was Marcus Webb. She thought about what 20 years of proximity meant, what it did to a person, to be that close to someone, and then to cross the line that separated inside from outside. She thought about what it must have felt like to cross it, whether it had felt like a decision or like something that happened incrementally, one small compromise at a time, until the accumulation of small compromises became indistinguishable from a different person entirely. She thought about whether Damien was thinking about the same thing. She looked at the side of his face. He was staring straight ahead. "He warned us about the van," she said. "Yes." "That wasn't nothing." "No." His voice was very quiet. "It wasn't nothing." She looked at the hallway, the clock, the institutional lights. "What are you going to do?" she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I don't know yet." A pause. "That's the honest answer. I don't know yet." She nodded. She didn't press it. The hallway was quiet. Her son moved, slow and certain and entirely indifferent to the specifics of the last 6 hours, and she pressed her hand against her side and felt the movement, and felt something underneath the exhaustion that was smaller and steadier than everything else. Something that had been there through all of it and had not left. Somewhere in the building, in a conference room 4 floors up, a woman named Adler was opening a drive that contained 4 years of Vivian Hale's work and beginning the process of converting it into the architecture of an outcome. Somewhere in Indianapolis, Conrad Rael was making the calculations of a man whose operation has just lost the thing it needed most. Somewhere on a street neither of them could see, Marcus Webb was standing in the pre-dawn dark, waiting. And in the hallway of the federal building, 2 people who had arrived at this moment from opposite ends of the worst year of both their lives sat in the particular silence of everything that was not yet resolved, and the night outside continued its slow, inevitable process of becoming something else, and the clock on the wall moved forward with the indifferent precision of time that does not wait for anyone to be ready before it becomes the next thing. And Damien Moretti looked at his hands and then looked at Vivian Hale sitting beside him, and opened his mouth to say the thing that had been in him since he'd walked into that warehouse office and seen her standing on her feet, not sitting, refusing to receive him from a chair even at 4 in the morning after the worst night of the last 6 months. And what came out was not the thing he'd planned to say, because he hadn't planned anything, had given up on planning in this specific context sometime between the plane and the bridge, and the moment she'd handed the drive to Adler without hesitation. And what came out instead was simple and unadorned and insufficient, and the only true thing he had. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The clock moved. She didn't answer him right away. Not because she didn't have an answer, because the answer was complicated in a way that 2 words couldn't reach, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise, and the hallway was quiet enough that she could afford to sit with it for a moment before she spoke. "I know," she said finally. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The recognition that the words were real, that they came from somewhere true, and that true was the minimum requirement for the conversation that would eventually need to happen between them. Not tonight, not in a federal building hallway at 4 in the morning with safety glass still in her hair and a sun pressing steadily against her ribs. But eventually. He didn't push it. That was new. The Damien she'd been married to would have needed to know immediately where they stood, would have converted the ambiguity into a negotiation because ambiguity was a condition he didn't permit in any situation he cared about controlling. This version, sitting with his hands on his knees and accepting "I know" as the full response, was different in a way she didn't have the energy to fully evaluate yet. She filed it. Later. Conrad Rael was arrested at 6:17 that morning in the parking structure of a downtown Indianapolis hotel, attempting to board a vehicle with falsified plates. The federal apparatus moved faster than anyone had predicted, which Adler later attributed to the quality of the documentation, specific, dated, corroborated by financial records that matched existing investigative threads the U.S. Attorney's Office had been pulling on for 2 years without enough to act. The drive gave them the architecture. The rest they already had. Thomas Ferraro was arrested in Chicago at 7:04, in his apartment, still in pajamas. He didn't resist. He sat down at his kitchen table when the agents came in and said nothing and asked for his attorney and maintained that position with the exhausted consistency of a man who had already made all his decisions and was done making new ones. Marcus Webb was not arrested. Damien found him at 5:30 in the morning on a bench in a park 3 blocks from the federal building, sitting in the dark and the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath making small clouds in the November air. Damien sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The park was empty. The city was beginning its slow, reluctant transition toward morning. "How long?" Damien said. Marcus looked at the ground. 4 years. Just over. Why? A long silence. Not evasion. Consideration. The answer Marcus gave was the one he'd been carrying for 4 years and had never said out loud, and saying it out loud gave it a different weight than it had had inside. "Because I watched you build something that consumed everything around it," Marcus said, "including her, including what she could have been, including what I thought we were doing this for, back when we were young enough to believe there was a what for." He paused. "Rael came to me because he thought I wanted money. I didn't want money. I wanted it to end. I wanted something to come from the outside and force it to end because you never would have ended it yourself." He looked at Damien sideways. "That's not an excuse. It's the reason. The difference matters to me even if it doesn't matter to you." Damien sat with that for a long time. The cold worked its way through his jacket. The sky in the east was beginning the very first tentative suggestion of lightning. Not dawn yet, but the memory of the possibility of it. "You put her in the line of it," Damien said. His voice was quiet and did not raise. "Whatever you thought you were doing, whatever end you thought you were forcing, you put her in the line of it and she was pregnant and you knew that." Marcus closed his eyes. The breath he let out was long and ragged at the edges. "Yes." "I need you to sit with that," Damien said. "Not with me, not with a lawyer, with yourself. For a long time." He stood up. Looked down at the man who had been the closest thing he had to a brother for 20 years. "I gave your name to Adler. What happens next isn't my decision." Marcus nodded. He didn't look up. Damien walked away. He didn't look back because looking back was something you did after you were clear of the thing. And he wasn't clear of this yet, and he understood that he wasn't going to be clear of it for a long time. 20 years didn't become a closed file in a single morning. But it became something different. It became the past, which is a different category from the present, and the present was what he had left to work with. He went back to the federal building. He sat in the lobby and waited until Vivian came out of the 4th floor at 8:45, when Adler released her with a formal statement of cooperation and a contact number and the particular brisk courtesy of a federal official who has just received the best intelligence package of her quarter and is already thinking about what comes next. Vivian came through the lobby looking exactly as tired as she was. She saw him. She stopped. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Marcus." "He's in the park. I told him what I told him. The rest is Adler's." She nodded slowly. She came and sat across from him in the lobby. Not beside him, across. The deliberate geometry of someone maintaining a distance they've earned the right to maintain. "I'm going back to Indianapolis," she said. "I have things to finish there. The lease, the job, loose ends." She paused. "And I need time. A real amount of time, not a few weeks." "I know," I'm not saying never. She held his eyes, because she was who she was, and she didn't soften things that needed to be said without softening. I'm saying I need to find out who I am when I'm not adjacent to you. I've been adjacent to you for 6 years, and I've spent the last 3 months finding out that I can build something on my own, and I need to know that isn't going to disappear the moment I let you back into proximity. He looked at her steadily. What do you need from me? Stay out of the way while I finish what I started. Don't send people. Don't call through channels. If you want to call me directly and let me decide whether I answer. She paused. And dismantle it. What you built. Not because Adler is going to make you, she'll give you options. There'll be cooperation terms. You'll have choices about what to surrender and what to restructure. I'm not talking about what Adler needs. I'm talking about what I need. She looked at him. I need you to want to put it down. Not because you have to, because you've decided it costs too much. A silence. Not 4 seconds. Longer. The lobby was beginning to fill with the morning's first ordinary business, people with badges and coffee cups, and the preoccupied momentum of a working day beginning. I've already decided that, he said. She looked at him carefully, reading it, the way she always had. I know, she said quietly. I can see that. A pause. That's why I said not never. She stood up. She put on her coat, the coat with the now empty lining, lighter than it had been in 4 years. And she looked at him once more. And what passed between them in that look was not resolution and not promise, and not the beginning of anything yet, but something true. Something that had survived the divorce papers and the cold office, and the 3 months and the broken window, and the federal hallway, and the bench in the park, and was still present, quiet and durable, and not requiring immediate definition. She walked out. He sat in the lobby for a while after that. He watched the morning build itself around him, the ordinary accumulating fact of people doing what people do, indifferent to the specific weight of the previous 12 hours. And he sat in the middle of it and breathed and let himself feel the full cost of it for the first time since the plane, since the tarmac, since Vasquez said the name Marcus Webb, and the floor went hollow under everything. It was significant. The cost was genuinely significant, and he didn't minimize it. He sat with it the way Vivian had told Marcus to sit with his, not with anyone, not performing the processing of it for an audience, just with himself and the weight of it, and the particular clarity that arrives after a very long night when the adrenaline is finally gone, and what remains is just the true shape of things. He had built something that consumed everything around it. Marcus had said that, and Marcus had been wrong about almost everything for 4 years, and right about that. He pulled out his phone. He called the one attorney in his organization whose record he had personally verified in the last 24 hours. He said, I need to start a process. Asset disclosure, voluntary cooperation, restructuring. I need to know what I can put down clean and what requires negotiation, and I need to start today. The attorney was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a significant decision. It's an obvious decision, Damien said. I was just late making it. He ended the call. He sat for another minute. Then he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the federal building into the Indianapolis morning, cold and gray and entirely ordinary. The kind of morning that doesn't know or care what was decided inside the buildings it passes, just continues being the next thing with the indifferent reliability of time moving forward. He didn't look back at the building. There was nothing behind him worth turning around for. What mattered was ahead, in the slow accumulation of days required to become someone different, which is the only kind of change that actually holds. Not the dramatic conversion, but the daily, unglamorous, frequently uncomfortable work of building something better than what you tore down. He had a son he had not yet met. He had time. He started walking.